This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Before we get started this week, I usually start off the show every week with a little tidbit about what the weather's like here in Wyoming, and well, nobody really cares about that, I understand. But I would like to remind everybody listening, first off, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. All of us here at VFC, we really, really do appreciate it. And that's not just lip service. I mean that we're stoked and excited that so many people want to join in this with us to help everybody else become better anglers as much as we can, right? That's what we're here for. We're here to help. We're here to help everybody out. Now, I would like to remind you that on the show, all the questions that I answer, these are all submitted from you, from the listeners. So please, if you have a question, please leave us some questions to answer. There's a link in the podcast description below that you can click to submit questions, and you can also find it on the blog.venturesflyco.com website. It's linked right at the top in our little nav bar there. Just go in, hit that button, submit your question, and then I'll answer it on the air, and we'll help everybody else learn. The show gets to continue rolling as we get more questions from you, the listener. So remember, find that podcast question submission button, hit it like it stole something from you, and we can start answering more questions from a variety of people around the country. Not to say that we don't have a great variety of people already, because we do. Our variety is fantastic, but we want more. We want as many questions from as many anglers, as many types of anglers as we can possibly get. So thank you for that. Now, let's dive right into it today. Our first question, where should I go fish on the green, winky face? When I'm trying to fish trout in Stillwater, what should I be looking for? This is from Luke from Wyoming. Gee, what a question, Luke. I'm assuming your joke, I'm assuming your question about where you should fish on the green is a joke, but if not, right below the dam at Flaming Gorge Reservoir. Go fish there. It'll be good for you. Okay. Trout in Stillwater, though. All right. This is something that's pretty challenging to a lot of anglers, myself included. I don't claim to be any kind of Stillwater expert, but luckily for us, there are other anglers who've made this their specialty. All right. It is what they do. All right. They know how to fish a lake like I know my way around a pizza joint. All right. All too well. So we're going to pull a lot of info from these experts to share with you to help answer this question about fishing in Stillwater. So Ross Purnell, first guy that I want to pull some stuff from. He wrote a great piece in Fly Fisherman magazine about this very topic, about trying to fish trout in Stillwater. And I've linked that in the podcast description. I would highly recommend you take a look at it. And then I also wrote a story about fishing alpine lakes in particular, because that is the Stillwater I fish the most often. And you can find that on the VFC blog. And of course, I'll leave a link to that in the podcast description as well. Now, what it really comes down to with fishing in Stillwater is a lot of the same theories that we hold by with stream fishing are going to be true for Stillwater. Okay, trout want to be where food is plentiful so they can expend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. Now, in a lake, they don't have the strong river current to contend with, so they'll cruise a little bit more looking for food. But generally, they're still gonna hold up where there's a lot of food, right? That's just what a natural predator like trout's gonna do. All right. Now, fish want structure as well. That's the other thing to remember here. Okay. That can be anything from like a submerged log to a point where the shore juts out into the water, to a spring or a channel between weed beds. All right. If the lake has an obvious inflow or outflow, chances are the trout will stack up there as well. All right. So the shore and shallow areas of a lake are going to be worth targeting because that's where a good amount of aquatic vegetation is going to grow. And that vegetation is the foundation for all of the aquatic insect life that fish will eat. So any obvious weed beds should be a big time target, as should the breaks in between the weed beds. All right, here's your story for this episode. There's this little lake down in Utah. That's where I grew up fishing. And that lake grows some of the biggest brook trout in the state. And it is mostly a flooded weed bed. It's a mess. It's a pain in the butt to fish because there's about 2 feet of water and then it's all weeds all the way. I think it's like a 20-something foot deep lake. It's pretty, relatively deep lake, but mostly weeds. And I would go up there in my float tube back when I used to float tube before I got too fat to do it. And I'm sure too many of you anglers out there listening can appreciate the frustration with getting too fat to float tube. Anyways, I'd go out there a lot, and as you're paddling out in the lake, you would see these big breaks in between the weed beds. There'd be a big weed bed and then just a dark drop off, just a big break down to the lake bottom. And then there'd be another weed bed. Usually there was a space of 5-6 feet in between the weed beds at most. Now, the brook trout in this lake, they would sit right inside that weed bed. And if you threw a black streamer to look like a leech out there and you sank it all the way to the bottom of that break in between the weed beds and just stripped it in nice and careful, you could be into some of the biggest brook trout you ever seen. My personal best out of that lake was like a 19-inch fish that I reckoned weighed about 4 pounds. I had some personal friends of mine go down there and catch fish that were, really, really big brookies, 21, 22-inch, like 6-pound fish. Really good brook trout, the kind that you go to Labrador for, that you take a Super Cub, a little float plane in for. And we got into this lake by a mile hike and a 2.5-hour drive. So pretty good payoff as far as the effort to get there and the fish that we got out of it. But what I learned from that was this exact concept of fishing that break in between the weed beds. Because anywhere else I fished in that lake, just kind of a no-go for catching those big brookies. Now, there were also cutthroat in that lake, and the lake had a very obvious inflow, and the cutthroat would stack up in that inflow like nobody's business, especially during the spawn. Now, I wasn't fishing for the cutthroat during the spawn, but you go to the inflow and look at them, and that was really cool to see. But in that inflow, and it was just there were 2 little streams that poured into the lake, and right where the water was moving, the fish just would always stack up right there, and you'd always see really big brook trout and really big cutthroat. I think my best cutthroat out of the lake was, I think it was a 5-pound cutty, so about 21 inches long, big fish. And I caught that one right out of the inflow in like September or something like that. So those are the 2 areas that I really can vouch for that you definitely want to be paying attention to, is breaks in between weed beds and inflows. Now, if you don't have a float tube and you can't get out there, then again, that's when we look back to structure. Okay, submerged logs, a point where the shore kind of juts out into the water. All right, that creates kind of like a hump that all the fish, as they're cruising the shallows, they have to go around that point. So it's a great place for you to set up and present them with food. Okay, and then the shallows themselves, the shore and shallow areas of lakes, these are worth targeting because that's where a bunch of the food source is going to be, especially in the spring and in the fall. Okay, where the water is the warmest there in the shallows, the fish are going to be cruising that. All right, so to recap all this info, you want and you need to find structure in a lake to fish around, whether that's a submerged log, submerged locks, points that jut into the water, weed beds, springs, inflows or outflows. That structure is a likely place for these fish to be hanging out. They want food as easily as they can get it, so they'll be in areas where the food is most likely to be found. Now, the more that you fish lakes, the better you're going to get at learning what these things look like. Okay, I can describe them to you. You can look at it in books, you can watch YouTube videos, but you really do need to spend some time out on a lake doing this for yourself to discover exactly what it looks like and where your flies need to be in relation to the fish and the depth and all that. You'll learn that through trial and error. But if you go out and okay, I'm looking for a point or I'm looking for a drop-off. Drop-offs are one of my favorites. If I can find a drop-off that's within casting distance of the shore, I set up there first on a lake, because that drop-off, it goes from really shallow to really deep, and there's that dark line. It's a great place for fish to hang out where they can't be seen by predators like ospreys or eagles that'll swoop down and eat them. And they can hang out there and they can ambush anything that goes over the drop-off. So it's a really good spot for trout to hang out. Love drop-offs. Okay, if you can find those, fish those. But the more that you fish lakes, the more you're going to recognize these little spots, all right? But just remember that weed beds and shallows, these are the nursery grounds for aquatic insects. So it's very likely fish are going to hang out there, especially early or late in the season, because that's where they're going to be filling up on the easy to chase down meals. So our next question, what's your best rig to get small flies to fish laying on the bottom of a pool? This comes to us, Ron from New York. Ron, great question. Thank you for sending that one in. So, Ron, your question here is about specific rig to help flies get down deep. So I'd also like to focus on other ways to help your flies get down to the right depth quickly, in addition to specific rigs, all right? So as far as specific rigs go, the key to getting small flies down deep is weight, right? You got to be a thick fly. I think that's what the kids say these days, right? It's got to be thick. If you want to get it down, it's got to be heavy. Okay, it's got to make a splash, all right? You can't have any of these like me back when I was like 18. Okay, you can't have that size of fly, because I was a stick. I floated when thrown into the water at that point, to be honest with you. I don't anymore. I make a cannibal. I scare all the fish. So I'd be an example of a fly that's probably too heavy to use. All right. Really though, weight is kind of your key. That's how things get down. All right. Whatever fly you're fishing, whatever fly you're trying to get down to the bottom, it needs to have some weight to it, or you need to use some split shot if there's not weight on that fly to get it down deep enough. So your nymphing rig for a specific rig to get flies down deep would be an indicator, split shot, first nymph, second nymph, in that order. All right. With small flies, the key is to give them longer to make it to the bottom of a pool, because smaller flies generally are going to weigh a little bit less, so they're not going to sink as quickly. They need a little bit more time to get down to the bottom of the pool. Right now, there are other things you can do to help your flies get down quickly from a technique and line management standpoint. And Dom Swintoski over at Trout Bitten, if you guys have ever checked his website out, he's got a fantastic story on this subject, which I will, of course, link in the podcast description, about how to get your flies down deeper. Now, he goes over 7 tips for how to get your flies down, and his number one is weight as well. The points he makes that I want to discuss, though, are about current seams and managing your drift as far as this pertains to your question, Ron. So first off, smaller flies, they usually need a bit longer to sink since they aren't as heavy as bigger flies. So you need to be able to extend your drift long enough to let that fly sink, all right? That way, you give them more time, they get down to the bottom, but you have to extend that drift. So what that might look like, that might mean that you cast 10, 15 feet further upstream than you think you need to. Okay, you put your flies all the way up there to give them extra time to sink before it gets right into the lie that you're like, oh, this is perfect. Or it might mean making a whole bunch of stack mends where you just mend one after another to keep your indicator basically not moving. All right, because you've got so much slack line out there that the current is pulling the line before it gets your indicator. If you can do stack mends like that, that would be a good way to go about it too. But managing your drift and giving those flies enough time to get down is going to be huge in getting those flies deep enough to get into fish. All right. The other point that Dom brings up in his article is that you need to pay attention to current seams. All right. If current moves in funky directions, okay, let's say it's not moving just straight downstream. Let's say it cuts a little to the left and then it cuts a little to the right. Okay. That can put tension on your line, which therefore stops the descent of your flies. So you want to make sure that your drift isn't going through so many current seams that pull your flies off the main current, or else you're going to have a really hard time getting those flies down deep enough. So again, you want to make sure that wherever your drift is, that it's straight enough, that it's not getting pulled left or right, that it's sitting right center in the middle of that seam, so those flies don't have extra tension on them, pulling them one way or the other, which would prohibit them from getting down deep enough. All right. So to recap, it's all about weight. Got to be fat. I'm fat. I own it. Okay. You need your flies to be that comfortable in their blubber as well, except I think blubber floats. So don't use blubber, use lead or whatever else it is. Tungsten beads. That's my favorite. All right. Use that. Okay. I prefer using weighted flies instead of split shot. I think we discussed that in like the first episode of the show. It all comes down to feel. You can feel the take a little bit better when the weight is all in your fly and not on your tippet, because then the fish has to move not only your fly, but it's got to move the split shot weight too. It kind of creates a little bit of a hinge. You can miss some takes that way. But if your flies aren't weighted heavily enough, split shot is going to work fine. Okay, we've caught plenty of fish on split shot. Everybody has. So don't worry don't feel like you're not going to do well enough if your flies aren't already heavy with tungsten and lead wrapped around the shank. Just go ahead and use split shot when you need to get them down, right? And then make sure that you're paying attention to your drift. Okay, give your flies the time they need to get down and make sure the current's not pulling them in weird directions, because that's going to extend the time that it takes for those flies to get down to the bottom. Thanks, Ron. That was a good question. And just a little bit of a mid-show reminder, we need questions. We need submissions from you, the listeners. So check out the link in the podcast description. There is a place where you can go submit your questions and have them answered on the show. That gives you a little bit of, I think the kids call it street cred these days. You can post about it on Instagram or Facebook. Say, my question was answered on Untangled. And people will be like, what's that? And then you can tell them, and then the show gets really big and nobody asks you what that is anymore. So at the end of the day, you're not just asking a question, you're furthering the cause. All right. So go ahead, ask questions. We love them. We need them. Submit your question. The link is in the podcast description. Check it out. All right. Our last question for the day. If you are just starting out, what are 3 of the most useful knots to master that will help you do about anything you need done on the water? There are so many knots, it can be overwhelming. This comes to us from Matt from Utah. So, Matt, as a former Boy Scout, I am a preeminent expert on knots. All right. But in the spirit of humility, I've asked around for some feedback on knots that everybody should know. Now, if you guys can't tell, I was being sarcastic. Yes, I did get my Eagle Scout. I grew up in Utah, after all. Who didn't get their Eagle Scout growing up in Utah? I mean, you'd have to be like most of my friends who didn't get theirs. Anyways, I have done my due diligence. I have looked at what knots experts recommend that we all need to know. I'm going to share those with you. All right. There's a video from Tom Rosenbauer. I'm going to link in the podcast description. It's actually an overview of the 3 knots that we're going to talk about today. So it's really helpful. You can see how they're all tied. Tom's a great teacher, as you should know. I mean, there's a reason Tom is the gold standard, right? Okay, we all measure ourselves against Tom for a reason. So first knot that you need to know is the clinch knot, right? A lot of people still call this the fisherman's knot too, so you might have heard it referred to as that, but it's the same thing. The clinch knot is my go-to for just about everything. I know that some anglers prefer the Davy knot, but I grew up using a clinch knot. I think a lot of other anglers did too, especially gear fishermen, spin fishermen in my neck of the woods. Everybody used the clinch knot growing up, so that it's pretty common. So this is the knot that I'm going to use to attach all my flies to leader and tippet. And then when I'm tying my dry dropper rigs, yes, I said dry dropper, I like to fish 3 because why not add a little bit of extra insanity to the fishing, right? No, I fish 3 because it's legal in the places that I like to fish. And I like the extra chance, all right? Anyways, clinch knot, all right? It's the do-it-all knot when you're putting together a fly fishing rig. Attach my flies to my leader, and flies to tippet. When I tie a piece of tippet off one fly to attach another fly in my rig, I'm using a clinch knot there. All right. It's what the clinch knot does for me. It's my go-to. It's my do-it-all. If I just need to tie something on, clinch knot. It's perfect. All right. The next knot is the surgeon knot. Now, this is a simple knot. It really is simple. And it's used to join two pieces of tippet together. So if you need to add a few feet of 5X tippet to your leader, for example, a surgeon knot is a great choice. It's strong and it's really easy to tie. It's a lot easier than a blood knot, which a lot of folks prefer because it has a slimmer profile. I've read in a few places that a blood knot is supposed to be stronger than a surgeon's knot too. But a blood knot, it's called a blood knot because you're going to start bleeding out of your eyes from frustration at tying the dang thing if you're anything like me. All right. Blood knots are just a pain in the butt sometimes. Now, that being said, once you master blood knot, it's really simple. They're a little tricky if you get down to like 6X tippet, but if you're at 6X tippet and you're tying a blood knot, I'm going to question what else you're doing with your life because that's just kind of interesting. So I'd like to come actually join you on the water and watch you do that. Anyways, surgeon's knot. All right. That's what it's mainly for. It is joining two pieces of tippet together. It's also really popular to create kind of drop shot style rigs when you're nymphing as well, because you cut the loop and one tag, you put your weight on, the other tag, you put your fly on. So I know a lot of Euro nymphers who do that as well, who use a surgeon's knot to put that rig together. It works out really well for them. Okay. The last knot that you need to know is the perfection loop. This is used to put a loop in your leader material so that you can attach leader to the end of a fly line that also has a loop. Okay, most fly lines today are sold with a welded loop on the end, and this perfection loop joins your leader to the loop on the end of the fly line perfectly. Now, if you dig into this at all, you're going to see there's a lot of folks who don't like the loop-to-loop connection, that prefer a nail knot connection or even a blood knot connection, and they don't like tying directly onto the PVC coating on a fly line. They'd rather tie directly to the braid core of a fly line. That's a little kind of above board for where we're hitting today on the show. But just know that exists. But perfection loops, that's what they're for, and it's really helpful when you need to put a loop in new leader material if you're building your own leaders, or if you get a big knot, have to cut down, and all of a sudden you've lost that loop that was tied in your leader already. Then you just go ahead, tie a new perfection loop, attach it to your fly line, and you're back in business. So really is that simple. All right. Now, that is going to wrap the show up for us today. I appreciate everybody who takes the time to listen to the show and give us feedback. It's been kind of fun watching this thing take off a little bit. And we're going to be here every week just answering your questions. So remember, if you've got a question, please, I'm begging you, all right, submit that so that we can answer them. That's our whole goal with the show. Like I said, the very first episode, we want to make this something that's a resource for everybody. So if you've got questions, go ahead and submit them. Check out the links in the podcast description as well to some of the other articles and authors and information that we discussed on today's show. And until next week, keep your lines tight, everybody, and have a good one.